Order. Tom Morrison to move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Lewell. It's an honour to serve under your chairship. I beg to move that the House has considered the safety of humanitarian workers in conflict zones. Thank you to those that have attended this debate, and can I thank the Minister for his presence here. It's greatly appreciated. Today we face more conflicts across the world at any point since World War II. 343 million people face hunger and starvation, whilst 1 in 6 children, that's 473 million, live in conflict zones or are displaced, the most in recorded history. Despite the dangers, there are estimated 500,000 workers in these areas attempting to support those that desperately need it. Rather than running away from the danger, they are running towards it, in an attempt to provide aid, shelter and support to those people in need. We should be celebrating them, but instead we are letting them down. 2024 was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian workers, with at least 325 aid workers killed. The majority of these were killed in Gaza. However, this is a crisis that spans across multiple conflict zones, with recorded attacks on aid workers in areas such as Ukraine, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, the DRC and Ethiopia. Despite being protected under international humanitarian law, these workers are under daily threat from conflict violence such as shelling and shootings. They often face violent intimidation, and we know there are several incidents of kidnapping and the use of sexual violence against them. And while this happens, the agencies and organisations that are impacted cannot speak. Whether it's fear of reprisals or worry that their funding will be cut and access blocked, many of the people I spoke to whilst preparing for this debate did it under the condition of anonymity. They need a voice, and today I hope that the House can provide one. Members will be aware of the awful killing of 15 paramedic and rescue workers on the 23rd of March in Rafah. The bodies of the workers were found buried in shallow graves a week later, next to their vehicles which had been crushed. Whilst the Israeli military were quick to claim that it had fired on suspicious vehicles driving in the dark without emergency lights or headlights on, video footage release of the attack showed that the claims of this scenario were false, and that not only were the emergency lights on and flashing, but the drivers also left the vehicles as the gunfire started. The Israeli military have since investigated the incident and have conceded that there was an operational misunderstanding and a breach of orders during a combat setting, which led to the killings. However, there is still to this date been no independent investigation into the incident. People would not miss the significance that this attack on the Red Crescent workers came almost a year to the day of the World Central Kitchen Aid Convoy attack back in April 2024, which took the lives of 7 aid workers, 3 of them British citizens. During this tragic incident, the convoy's route had been coordinated in advance, but the coordinates were misidentified. The humanitarian notification system is used to alert parties in conflict zones of the location of aid and humanitarian workers and their facilities in order to protect workers in conflict zones. One agency told me how the system used in Gaza is completely inadequate and often ignored. They said, "At this point, we are using the HNS as an accountability measure, not a protective one." Another worker who supported a charity working in the refugee camps around the occupied territories of Palestine, he described me how the camps he worked in were managed with no armed support or protection. There have been times when he and the team he was with were completely outnumbered by people clamouring for help and support. They were desperate, and so naturally things became fevered and chaotic. He said to me, "The safest I felt was when I was in the hotel 2 hours away, surrounded by metal detectors and armed guards. But during the day, I was in the camps, with no support or guards in sight. We were completely alone. We were completely forgotten." A further aid worker told me, "When you congregate groups of people, your chances of being targeted increase massively. We do our best to limit numbers, but every single one of our beneficiaries and us are placed inadvertently at risk wherever we work." The picture these workers paint a similar story time and time again, that humanitarian workers are often alone and unsupported, with no way to defend themselves. What is now known as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, Sudan's war has seen over 12 million people displaced and over 30 million people needing humanitarian aid. but over 387 aid workers have been killed in Sudan over the last 5 years, with a large proportion of them being national workers. In the last year, 18 workers have been kidnapped. There is mounting evidence that these attacks have been the product of deliberate targeting, including aerial bombardments, attacks on refugee camps, and violent incidents against local responders. Islamic Relief, who have offices in the area, have had to relocate several times. One person told me that each move was a desperate escape from advancing militias, looters and gunmen. Roads were lined with armed checkpoints, towns were besieged, their office in Sennar even became a target. And because of this, many aid agencies are now pausing or suspending their operations in Sudan, leading to a worsening of the humanitarian crisis. Chair, I could go on with examples, each worse and more harrowing than the last. Certainly.
I'm grateful to him for giving way because he's making a very significant speech here, and it's something that should concern us all. Wherever you find these abuses, whether it is in Gaza or Sudan or in any other theatre, does he agree with me that these things don't just happen by accident? They happen because forces like the Israeli Defence Force, for example, are effectively given licence to do this by their government. And that's why, on a government-to-government basis, there is something that we in this country can actively do to make it clear to governments that are responsible for this treatment that it is not acceptable, and that we will take action to highlight their abuse and to remove support from them.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he's absolutely right. And I will go on in it later in this speech that there is an element of political will that we can partake to make sure that we crack down on these abuses. When this debate was secured, I was inundated with responses from organisations and workers, all who wanted to share their story, all who wanted their voice to be heard. And whilst all of these stories are deeply personal, they all contain the same theme. All of them felt that they'd been forgotten. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, these workers are running into danger to save lives. Often they are local responders, people who live in the very communities that are impacted. And often they are volunteers. It is incumbent on this House and the government to do all we can to ensure those volunteers are safe, protected and supported. When talking to the organisations and workers who contacted me, the majority of them mentioned political will. It's clear that the government needs to do more in terms of providing clear, consistent leadership on the world stage. Without this, it risks undermining the UK's commitments to international law. Certainly.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that bomb disposal experts like the British national recently injured in Gaza play a vital humanitarian role in conflict zones, and that attacks on humanitarian facilities are a grave breach of international law which must urgently be addressed through prosecutions?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and absolutely. All breaks of international humanitarian law need to be properly investigated, and those who break it need to be brought to prosecution. In April 2025, the UN's Assistant Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs emphasised that there is no shortage of robust legal frameworks to ensure humanitarian workers are protected. But, I quote, "What is lacking is the political will to comply." Now, many of us here have sat in the chamber and heard the government roll out the same line time and time again when asked to apply pressure on state and non-state actors when it comes to complying with international law. The UK government should not underestimate its power to influence global change on this issue. But now is the time to step up and be a leader. Therefore, I urge the government to push for greater accountability where violations occur and prosecute those that attack aid workers as breaches of international law. Work with the UN to ensure better and more responsive humanitarian notification systems are in place, so they work as protective measures, not just as accountability measures. Train partners to improve security procedures and responsibilities under international human law, and provide mental health support for those workers who have served in conflict zones. Introduce a presumption of denial for arms exports to governments listed as human rights concerns in the Foreign Office's Human Rights Report. And finally, The government must reverse its decision to cut international aid. The world faces the biggest humanitarian crisis since 1945. Cutting the aid budget is not only counterproductive, but it also damages our country's standing in the world. It is clear from stories many of us have heard that charities and NGOs who are managing vital work in some of the most dangerous situations need more resources to protect their staff and volunteers. The government must reconsider this dreadful decision. Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity to open this debate. I wanted to use my platform to give a voice to those people and organisations that cannot, for many reasons, speak for themselves. We have experienced the most dangerous year ever for humanitarian workers, and there is no sign that this situation will improve. It is therefore vital that the government acts now.
This House has considered safety of humanitarian workers in conflict zones. Jim Shannon.
Your chairship, and it's always a pleasure because you're a good friend of mine for many years, but nice to see you in the place as well and doing well. Thank you. Can I first of all congratulate the honourable gentleman for Cheadle for leading today's debate on this issue, and I know that others who will participate will support what he has said, but also maybe give some examples of where we need to focus. There's absolutely no doubt that humanitarian workers face unprecedented dangers through merely doing their jobs, and I think we all are greatly in awe of them who do their jobs and the courage, the bravery, the dedication, the commitment that they show. So a big thank you to them as well. Whenever they're doing those aid jobs, they should always be protected. Unfortunately, we have seen too many examples across the world where the protection has not been offered by those who were in that position to do that. So I recognise what the honourable gentleman said and the importance of giving them the safety and support that they need. They are pivotal in providing aid and medical assistance and operate in high-tension environments to protect those suffering from war. They really are those who rush in at the last minute to give protection, to give safety, to give that protection that those innocent people need to have. And he's right to underline that. And it is imperative that we do all we can to support them in doing their jobs. So for that purpose, it's important that those who are able to are here to support and discuss and give that support that they need across the world. According to the stats, and stats are always important because it gives you an idea of what's happening across the world. UN data is clear, 2023 and 2024, they say we're amongst the deadliest years for AIDS workers. In 2024 alone, some 280 humanitarian workers were killed. Workers are increasingly specifically targeted, and it's a case of it's not a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're there doing the job at the right time, but find themselves being targeted by those who should have who are there to protect them in many cases, and those who probably in some cases just want to destroy the work that they're doing because they know the impact that it has. Better protection mechanisms are imperative in preserving safety and ensuring that they are able to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And today in this House, I commend them for what they do, and I wish only that others could recognise it in the same way. Not only are they risking their lives every day, but being that point of contact for those in desperate need. Recognise the good work they do first, protect them, and make sure that happens. To name some recent examples we have seen in Sudan, an honourable gentleman referred to it, that aid has been obstructed by the Sudanese armed forces. Sudan is one of those countries in the world where the depravity, the violence, the cruelty, the evil of man against his man, woman and children are incredibly hard to understand. The United Nations has reported that 22 aid workers have been killed since the conflict began in April 2023, not to mention the depravity that those killers have against the female aid workers, because they've reported sexual exploitation. And I'm of a generation, Madam Chair, and forgive me for saying it, but we always looked out for ladies. You'd open the door for a lady to let her through the door before you had made a move. You always had to carry the bags home. You could say there's wee silly things, wee small things, but that was the respect we had for women and ladies whenever I was growing up. Today, that respect is no longer there in the places that it should be evil seems to have its way, and I find it incredibly difficult to recognize, to read some of those stories as you see them in the press. Furthermore, the safety of humanitarian workers in Afghanistan has been extremely compromised since the Taliban took over power in 2021. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has identified Afghanistan as one of the most hazardous environments for aid workers globally. Between 2022 and 2024, at least 38 aid workers were killed, predominantly those who carried out the polio vaccinations, and medical workers as well. Indeed, some of those involved in education have also been targeted and killed as well. The restriction on female participation has also increased dramatically, whereby they must adhere to a strict dress code and be accompanied by male guardianship. These are just a couple of examples where the situation is prevalent. And as an international counterpart, we must, I believe, do more to protect those that are doing their best to help other people. The Honourable Gentleman for Cheadle also mentioned, and he's right to mention the issue because it's also important, is the aid budget. It is disappointing that government has decided to reduce the aid budget, and the impacts of that will be great. In my constituency of Strangford, we have many church groups who through the NGOs and through the work at their missionary societies do help with those who have need vaccinations, whether it be polio, will it be for AIDS, all the work and the vaccine and the good work that the aid budget has done. And unfortunately now there's a question mark over how much more can it continue at the same level. So I do agree with the Honourable Gentleman and put on record my support for what he has said. And I know the Minister will say that, and he's right in the way, that the monies are tight, and I understand that. But there is something I believe it could be done. I'm suggesting to the Minister that one of the things that maybe might fill some of that gap, won't fill all the gap financially, but it will fill some of it, will be working with church groups across the United Kingdom who are already out there in Swaziland, for example, in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, and Kenya, and Uganda, the ones that I know, Nigeria as well, are some of the other ones. And it is possible to work alongside them. So if the Minister has any thoughts and ideas now, I would really appreciate that, because I believe it's something that a partnership could be arrived at in relation to some of the work that can be done with the reduced budget that the Honourable Gentleman now has. Again, I wish to conclude, Madam Chair, if I can. We must work alongside our counterparts within the UN to ensure that the humanitarian workers are protected. In 2024, the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, alongside other countries, formed the Ministerial Group for the Protection of Humanitarian Personnel. So what can be done? There's two things that they recommended, and I would suggest these are practical things, but they are important to ensure that they have pushed for enhanced digital tracking and safety systems. They've also pushed for improved local partnerships, because when you're in a dangerous situation, as the humanitarian workers are, and they always are by the nature of the work that they do, I think it's important that partnership with those on the ground, and where it went wrong, lessons need to be learnt. So I look very much to the Minister for his commitment and his response. I know I'll never be found wanting in the questions that I ask, and I thank him for that. And we can do to support this initiative and ensure the safety of those that work so hard. And again, the Honourable Gentleman for Cheadle, well done. And I look forward very much to the Shadow Ministers and the Lib Dem spokesperson making their contributions to how we can do it better together. Thank you.
Edward Morello.
Thank you very much, Ms Lewell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I would like to add my thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, for securing this important debate. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I've been fortunate to meet those on the front line of humanitarian responses, often in some of the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. These are individuals who willingly step into uncertainty. Many do so for less financial reward than they may find elsewhere, and are not driven by a salary, but rather the conviction that service to others is worth so much more. Their work is not getting easier. From Gaza to Sudan, from the DRC to Ukraine, humanitarian workers are confronting a growing number of complex emergencies where conflict, displacement, disease, food insecurity and climate disruption are regular occurrences. In 2024, the Armed Conflict Location and Event data estimated that 1 in 8 people worldwide were exposed to armed conflict. Every day, thousands continue their work, delivering aid, supporting fragile health systems, and helping communities rebuild. International humanitarian law exists to protect these workers, and yet in recent years that protection has been eroded. Aid convoys have been attacked, humanitarian staff detained, entire operations halted due to insecurity. The apparent lack of consequence for these incidents sends a dangerous message, not only to those in the field, but to the international system as a whole. The UK should be at the forefront of challenging that trend. We must continue to be a voice to uphold the Geneva Convention, to strengthen accountability mechanisms, and to press for practical tools such as early warning systems and negotiated humanitarian corridors that allow aid to reach those who need it most. The protection of aid workers should never be up for negotiation, and it must not depend on whether or not a crisis is in the headlines. Sadly, the very resources needed to carry out this life-saving work are under threat. The reduction in the UK's official development assistance from 0.5 to 0.3% of GNI by 2027 will lead to the closure of health programmes, of education services and nutrition schemes in some of the world's most fragile states. At the same time, cuts to USAID in the United States are significantly adding to the pressure both aid organisations and workers are feeling. What we are seeing in real terms is food rotting at border crossings, vaccines that cannot be delivered, aid workers unable to access food, fuels, shelter and basic supplies. The result is not only increased suffering on the ground, but a shrinking of the humanitarian space at precisely the moment we need it to expand. And this retreat is not just a budgetary issue, it is a strategic and moral one. When the UK stepped back, others filled the void, often with radically different intentions. We risk weakening the international order we helped to build, and in doing so, we abandon those who continue to act in our name, under our flag, and in line with the values we claim to defend. The government must also ensure that British citizens serving in humanitarian roles overseas are supported, recognised and valued. One of my constituents, who deployed as an aid worker to Ukraine, shared his experience with me of working under the threat of missile attacks without heating, running water or electricity. He was not seeking praise. He was asking whether this House values public service. The introduction of the humanitarian medal was an important step, but the decision to exclude those who deployed to Ukraine prior to July 2023 from eligibility is deeply disappointing. For those who answered the call during the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe, the absence of formal recognition feels not only unfair, but inconsistent with the spirit of the medal itself. The previous government explicitly removed the 5-year rule and only allowed eligibility for events from 19th of July 2023 onwards. I would like to ask the Minister how many British humanitarians have deployed across the globe and how many of them will be ineligible for the medal due to the 2023 cut-off date. I would also like the Minister to use this opportunity to pledge to remove this cut-off so that all those who answered the humanitarian call can be recognised. I will give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder if he'd be so kind as to pass on my gratitude to his constituent and perhaps echo my gratitude for anybody from our country who puts themselves in harm's way, not for financial recognition, but for something that transcends politics altogether, and that is for humanity.
I thank my gallant friend for his intervention as somebody who has in fact himself put himself in harm's way. I think that was a wonderful sentiment. There is a broader issue here of how we treat those who work on the front line of global emergencies, often representing this country's values abroad. That includes how we fund and support the organisations they work through. We should remember that humanitarian work is not only about crisis response, it is about prevention, resilience and stability. When that work is undermined, it is not just the world's most vulnerable who pay the price, it is all of us. Because the effects of conflict, of poverty and displacement do not stop at borders. They shape our security, our trade, and the kind of world we leave behind. So I hope this debate will serve as a moment to reflect not only on what humanitarian workers do, but what we owe them, in policy, in practice, and in principle. Thank you.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Ms Llewellyn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I want to extend my gratitude to my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, for bringing this extremely important debate. As has been mentioned, I completely concur. I can't think of a more noble profession than that of humanitarian aid workers. These are the people that go into areas that everyone else is trying to flee from. Their work is driven by compassion, courage, and commitment to the most desperate and vulnerable. It is simply indispensable work. It is all the more shocking that conflict zones have become deadlier for those trying to help. Aid workers have been kidnapped, injured, and killed while performing their duties. Hospitals, paramedics, and aid convoys, clearly marked and protected under international law, have been deliberately targeted or caught in the crossfire. In some places, providing aid has become as dangerous as fighting in the war itself. The statistics speak for themselves. In Gaza, at least 418 aid workers have been killed since October 2023, almost all Palestinian, but including at least 8 internationals. At least 1,400 health workers have been killed, although there may be some overlap with the above number. Both health workers and aid workers, like the PRCS. And at least 42 aid workers have been killed so far in 2025. In Lebanon, Israel has killed over 200 aid workers. Last week, I attended a viewing of a documentary called Israel's War on Medics, where we learnt the tactic that was chillingly called double tap. The double tap is where an invading force will attack a building or a location and then wait until the aid workers, paramedics and first responders arrive. And after they have arrived, they will then attack the same place again. And this has resulted in the death and maiming of many, many case workers. Some of these... of course I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He made a really interesting point, which rang an alarm bell in my mind, because what he's describing are the same tactics being used by the State of Israel, or at least its government, as were exhibited by the IRA back in the 1980s, whereby a bomb would be set off, and then once help had arrived, a secondary device would have been set off at the point of evacuation. Does he recognise this, as I do, as terrorism?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and that is absolutely the classic definition of terrorism in my view. Some of these killings, like the murder of 14 emergency workers and a UN worker on the 23rd of March by Israel earlier this year, are reported, but many are not. The lives of these aid workers are casually and brutally murdered. In Gaza, the lives of the aid workers are casually and brutally taken by the Israeli regime, destroying the entire infrastructure of civilized life in Gaza, and especially the healthcare system. They are deliberately and have deliberately targeted the healthcare system as a tactic in war and to achieve their aims of ethnic cleansing. Their policy is to make life simply unlivable for the Palestinians. I'm not the only one who is struck by the contrast in the way this government responds to any humanitarian outrages in Ukraine,
with calls for more sanctions and measures on Russia, and its apparent fatalism to when such attacks take place in Gaza. Apparently, for this government, some lives are more equal than others. This is not the case under international humanitarian law. A Palestinian life is equal to an Israeli life, which is equal to a Ukrainian life and every other life on this planet. International law considers all parties to a conflict are obligated to protect aid workers and ensure safe access to civilians in need. We must call for and provide greater accountability for those who target aid workers. We must support stronger security measures and better coordination in dangerous areas. And most of all, we must never normalise these attacks. To that end, I support the calls from the humanitarian charity Islamic Relief for the government to urge all parties to a conflict to comply with international law. This includes compliance with obligations relating to the passage of humanitarian supplies, equipment and personnel, and respecting and protecting aid workers. To lead efforts and strengthen commitments to protect aid workers and finalise the political declaration on the protection of humanitarian workers initiated by the Australia-led Ministers' Group, and commit to concrete actions that go beyond rhetoric, including reporting mechanisms and monitoring of compliance, and to increase funding for international and local humanitarian organisations operating in conflict zones, ensuring they have resources and protection needed to deliver safety. I was absolutely flabbergasted when the government decided to slash aid budget to redirect those funds to purchasing more bombs, bullets, tanks and drones. And I would like to ask the Minister to share the impact assessment of this decision on the safety and security of aid workers, but also the increased risk of greater conflict and greater wars than if we actually support the people in need. Thank you.
Mr. Lowe, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd also like to add my thanks to the member for Cheadle, my honourable friend, for bringing this debate today. Across conflict lines from Gaza to South Sudan, the Congo, Syria and Ukraine, people wearing nothing more than a high-vis vest risk and too often lose their lives to keep hope alive. The United Nations warns that 2024 is already the deadliest year on record for humanitarian workers, with many, as we've heard, 325 dying in that year, and many of those, of course, died in Gaza. This included 7 people working for the food aid charity World Central Kitchen, who were killed in an Israeli strike. Those who died were Australian, Polish, British Palestinian, along with a dual US-Canadian citizen. The thought of British-made arms that could have been used in strikes such as these is completely unacceptable. The Liberal Democrats are calling on the government to immediately suspend the supply of British arms exports to Israel. Today, children are dying of starvation in Gaza as Israel prevents food aid from reaching them, while hospitals are destroyed and medical treatment is vanishing under the Israeli bombardment. And those who are providing life-saving aid are dying alongside. Madam Chair, protection of these committed humanitarian workers is not an abstract principle. It's a vital under international humanitarian law, and it deserves to be properly funded. Safety training, armoured transport, secure radios and trauma counselling all cost money, yet while danger rises, funding falls. My constituents in Mid Dumbartonshire care, and they're asking me to raise this with the government to recognise the value and the sacrifice of aid workers and medical staff. The UK aid budget dropped from nearly £15.5 billion in 2023 to £14 billion in 2024, down to 0.5% of national income, and ministers now float a further cut to 0.3%. Every fraction shaved off forces agencies to cancel evacuations, postpone security upgrades, and send workers out with less protection. Less money on the ledger means more names on the memorial. We can't credibly insist that combatants respect humanitarian space while dismantling the lifeline that keeps that space viable. I'd therefore like to encourage the government to reassess its approach to aid funding and to view it not just as a tool to help those in need, but as a tool to prevent future conflict and to protect aid workers, alongside vigorous diplomacy to prosecute those who target aid workers. If we truly want a safer world, we must safeguard the people who deliver the world's help. Cutting aid does the opposite, and the price is paid in human lives. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms Lewell. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship today, and I would like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, for securing this very important debate. Our world is becoming more dangerous. Today, over 120 conflict zones scar dozens of nations. The UN estimates that almost 90% of the resulting casualties are civilians, and the IRC calculates that over 300 million people right now are in need of humanitarian aid. That need is disproportionately concentrated in just a handful of countries, and it is in these places, some of the world's most dangerous, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar and others, that humanitarian aid workers are both most needed and most under threat. 224 was the most dangerous year on record for aid workers. At least 325 lost their lives, the overwhelming majority of whom were national rather than international staff. We face a difficult confluence of proliferating conflict, even as we reduce funding for development, stability building, and humanitarian response. Conflict is changing. Fewer wars are being fought between states and more within states by various armed groups, particularly within urban areas. Efforts towards conflict prevention and peace building are not working, and global tensions are rising. The UK holds an important position in upholding and calling out abuses of international humanitarian law and in its responsibilities in funding development and aid in conflict zones. I regret that we have seen from this Labour government the deepest cuts in international aid this century, a shameful retreat from the party's legacy under the last Labour government. It is shameful that the UK is not opposing but following the global trend of abandoning international solidarity, certainly when it comes to funding overseas development. I urge the government to row back on its cuts to aid and to stand steadfast as a global development leader. And while development work needs money, it also requires a heavy lifting of diplomacy, not least to ensure adherence to international law, since aid workers today are facing increasing harm. Aid workers make personal sacrifices and place themselves in harm's way to deliver life-saving assistance. It is deeply worrying, therefore, to see a growing disregard for humanitarian workers, indeed for humanitarian law in conflicts across the world. I took part in the International Development Committee's trip to Geneva last month, where we met with UN agencies and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The IDC is investigating the protection of aid workers, and I look forward to the Minister receiving and reading our report. I was reassured by the International Committee for the Red Cross that international humanitarian law is robust, it is strong and protective, that there is no need for a renegotiation of Geneva Conventions, but concerned to hear from them that its implementation is becoming more and more problematic. The problem is not with the law, but with non-compliance and attempts to undermine it. There must be more and stronger measures of accountability. The Aid Worker Security Database counted 247 major attacks against aid workers in 2022, 281 in 2023, and 402 in 2024. Insecurity Insight has calculated that instances of drone-delivered explosives directed by named state forces towards aid or health programmes rose by a factor of 25 between 2022 and 2024. In written evidence to the International Development Committee, the organisation also testified that expansions of violence into major conflict zones have coincided with rising attacks on humanitarian operations, particularly health facilities, refugee and IDP camps, and aid offices. There have been far too many horrifying examples. Last year in Sudan, the ICRC lost 2 drivers to gunmen, and the WPF lost 3 aid workers following aerial bombardment. Gaza has been by far the deadliest single location for aid workers, with over 212 losing their lives in the Strip last year. And the whole House was horrified at the end of March by Israel's killing of 15 aid workers, and that has been shared by many members. The UK must lead on efforts to stop all attacks on aid workers. The recent cancellation of the conference on the high contracting parties to the 4th Geneva Convention due to, quote, profound differences only underscores the growing challenges for those committed to upholding international law. The government has repeatedly said that it is using its Security Council seat and bilateral relations to encourage aid access and aid worker protection. So can the Minister share what specific bilateral meetings this government has had with state and non-state actors regarding the protection of aid workers in Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, Ukraine and Myanmar? Can he share what specific steps the government is taking to build international support in multilateral forums for protecting aid workers and strengthening the legal frameworks binding the actions of combatants? Accountability is critical, both for justice and for deterrence. The UK provides funding for the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court through ODA. Can the Minister confirm whether, once most of the cuts occur in 2026 to 27, the UK will maintain contributions to international courts, including non-assessed discretionary spending? The UK needs to ask itself an important question. What does standing up for international humanitarian law look like? We must be prepared to roll up our sleeves and tell our friends and allies to adhere to international humanitarian law or face consequential action. Can the Minister outline what the UK is doing to ensure there is accountability for all of those who attack aid workers? Most casualties of aid workers are nationals, but last year 3 Britons were killed when Israel struck World Central Kitchen workers in Gaza. This appalling incident highlighted both the ongoing need for accountability and for the protection of brave people doing humanitarian work overseas, including our own nationals. What steps is the Minister taking then to safeguard British aid workers in conflict zones or those completing British projects? I welcome the government joining with partners and allies in September to form a ministerial group focused on enhancing the protection of humanitarian personnel and reversing the growing trend of attacks upon them, and urge the government to push forward with this engagement. But even as aid workers are kidnapped, wounded and killed, aid itself is too often being treated as just another instrument of war. We can see this in specific conflicts. Israel's total blockade of all aid into Gaza, which has now been in place for more than 50 days, is deepening the already terrible suffering of Gazans. Yesterday, the ICJ opened hearings on precisely this point, and in the Chamber, I asked the Minister to confirm that the government will recognise the court's judgment when it comes on Israel's responsibility under international law to facilitate aid to the people of Gaza. I did not receive a reply then, so will his colleague, the Minister, please give me a reply now? Another conflict characterised by the denial of aid access is the ongoing war in Sudan. This catastrophe, the world's largest, has left 25 million people in need of food aid. Throughout all, sides have blocked humanitarian assistance to civilians. Changes to warfare are having a profound impact on aid workers' safety. The more permissive environment regarding international humanitarian law threatens medical personnel and infrastructure, which is being targeted. Technological changes to war, in particular the use of drones, and the increasing prevalence of aerial bombardment are increasing the peril of aid workers. Around 60% of aid workers' deaths in Gaza last year were attributable to aerial bombardment. How are the government's efforts to safeguard aid workers and uphold international humanitarian law taking account of these specific dangers? And how is the UK ensuring accountability frameworks cover the use of drones and related tactics to double tap strikes? Lastly, there is a false belief that democracies will automatically act ethically in war. But the current permissive nature of adherence to IHL has shown that this is not the case. There is a need to train armed forces as defence investment increases. The UK leads in this regard. So how can the UK share this best practice to ensure that IHL is upheld in conflict zones? The UK has a leading role to play in diplomatic efforts to ensure the protection of aid workers through upholding international humanitarian law, and I urge the government to do so with the vigour we would expect by leadership so experienced in that. But it also, in concert, must play a leadership role in international development and the funding of deconfliction and stabilising nations. The cuts to UK aid will only exacerbate conflict, and I urge the government to reconsider these cuts, return to the 0.7% of GNI on ODA and continue a proud UK legacy. Now, and this deadliest year, is not the time to row back.
Thank you, Ms Lewell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And let me start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Cheadle for securing this debate today. I think it's fair to say honourable members who have contributed today have really been able to bring and demonstrate their knowledge and the conversations that they have had from the sector. I think we all agree that those who work in the humanitarian aid sector, especially in conflict zones, do an incredibly important job under very challenging circumstances. From multilateral to localised grassroots organisations, there are so many in the sector to acknowledge, but in the interests of time, I will be brief. But first of all, I would like to thank the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, who the Shadow Foreign Secretary and I have met with recently. The ICRC's expertise and neutrality enables them to reach some of the most difficult areas, and they work in over 90 countries. I would also like to thank FCDO staff, who I know work on the UK's humanitarian programmes. These are highly dedicated individuals who work often around the clock, and we are grateful for their efforts. The 4th of April was Mine Awareness Day, and I'd like to pay tribute to the Halo Trust and the Mine Advisory Group. These are examples of great British organisations who work globally to lead efforts in demining and restoring land in post-conflict communities. There are some remarkable achievements, but as Halo and MAG demonstrate, there is so much more to do if we are really able to reach a minefield world. Provisional ODA spend figures for 2024 show that 1.4 billion of bilateral ODA was spent on humanitarian assistance, which was an increase of 60% from 2023. And this really does underline the impact of global crises and conflicts. In the 2023 International Development White Paper, we outlined tackling conflict and state fragility as a priority. And part of our vision for 2030 was greater emphasis on improving foresight and conflict prevention. It's also worth remembering that the UK is uniquely placed to be a leader in this area, with our groundbreaking data science, our AI, machine learning, and open source intelligence capabilities. And this new technology can be used to expedite forecasting of conflict and mass atrocity risks, buying time for a response from a few months to a few years in advance. There are some specific questions that I would like to ask the Minister today. I would like to start by asking him if he can update us on what his department is doing to continue this work and what discussions he's had with the UK science, technology and research sectors to leverage expertise into conflict prevention abroad. But of course, as well as the clear humanitarian need of civilians in conflict zones, colleagues are right to raise concerns about the safety of humanitarian workers working to deliver aid. and I would like to press the Minister on a few of these specific conflict zones. Firstly, I'd like to turn to Ukraine. In January this year, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimated that there are 12.7 million Ukrainians in need, of which 6 million will be targeted by aid agencies in 2025. So can the Minister reassure us what steps he is taking to support the safety of aid workers operating near the front lines? Disinformation, including Russian disinformation, is another challenge that can compromise the safety of aid workers. So what assessment has the Minister made of the impact of disinformation on the ability of humanitarian agencies to function in Ukraine, and what steps is he taking to counter it? Turning to Sudan, where millions of innocent people have been affected by this appalling conflict, and the humanitarian need is dire. Madam Chairman, it was regrettable that the Foreign Secretary's conference in London failed to settle on a final communique among the parties present to agree a long-term political solution. But clearly a transition to a truly inclusive, civilian-led government is crucial, and we should not lose sight of that. On the ground, we know that aid access and delivery is an enduring challenge. So what assessment has the Minister made of incidences of aid blocking in Sudan, and what steps are being taken to protect humanitarian workers trying to deliver that aid? Turning to the Middle East, we are in a very difficult moment with a breakdown of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and we need this government to ensure the UK is a proactive participant in efforts to find a way through. On aid access, can the Minister update us on the practical efforts he is making to unblock the current situation, including updating us on recent engagement with the Government of Israel on this, and what his assessment of the amount of UK-funded aid is getting through?
On that point, will the Minister?
Very briefly.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. In earlier parts of the current conflict, where aid was blocked, there were airdrops from different nations, the UN. I'm not aware the participation of the UK government, but would she agree with me that there is an immediate need for every single channel through which aid can get into Gaza to be put in place and used?
Thank you. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I'll leave the specific point of airdrops to the Minister, and perhaps he will pick up on that. But I think, Madam Chairman, wherever the conflict is, when it comes to the getting aid through to where it is needed, I think it's incumbent upon all players to do the utmost to make sure that aid gets through, which is why those of us on these benches often do and will continue to press the government when it comes to that important issue of access, as I've done this afternoon. I'd also be grateful for an update on his discussions following the death of the 15 aid workers in Gaza in March, and on the need for effective deconfliction in this conflict. And can he also tell us how his department is working with the ICRC and other agencies to help ensure they can operate safely and to minimise the risks? And finally, I would like to touch on Myanmar, where, despite a ceasefire agreed by the warring parties following the devastating earthquake, fighting has reportedly continued. We understand it's a very hostile environment for traditional aid agencies operating Myanmar, and so the FCDO has opted for a grassroots approach to aid delivery. But what recent assessment has the Minister made of the effectiveness of this approach in getting aid to where it's needed, and also, and importantly, protecting aid workers? Has the earthquake affected the balance between working with localised grassroots organisations and more traditional humanitarian agencies? If we are working with more multilateral agencies, what steps is he taking to ensure they can operate safely? Mrs Lewell, there are too many good humanitarian organisations and sadly too many conflicts to name and discuss them all today in the short time we have. But I do want to be very clear that in no way diminishes their importance or the impact on civilians and humanitarian workers who are grappling with their consequences. So, as I bring my remarks to a close, I want to again put on record our thanks to all those who put themselves at risk to deliver life-saving support to people in desperate situations. We are living in a more dangerous world, and there are more competing demands for humanitarian assistance. It's essential that these brave individuals can work safely and without fear, so they can focus on supporting the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Ms Lowell, and a genuine pleasure to be under your chairpersonship today. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Cheadle for securing today's debate and highlighting the grave threats facing aid and humanitarian workers around the world. And I say that with genuine sincerity, having spent many years myself working for humanitarian NGOs and the former DFID, and as a former member of the International Development Committee, along with a number of members, honourable members in this room. And I have indeed witnessed myself the courageous work of humanitarian workers and indeed FCDO and formerly FCO and DFID staff in extremely challenging situations around the world. They have always operated in dangerous environments, but the threats they face today, as has been highlighted, are escalating to intolerable levels, with many paying the ultimate price, as has been highlighted so powerfully. And their protection is essential for agencies to operate, for obligations in international law, and indeed for our shared humanity. And I welcome the International Development Committee's ongoing inquiry on this topic, and the committee's focus on safety and protection of these courageous individuals is timely and vital, and we will engage with the committee fully on that and consider its findings. And as I said, these things are deeply personal to me, along with the late and missed colleague of ours, Joe Cox. I worked with many and even at the present time have friends working in some of these environments in agencies, including in some of the circumstances that have been described today. So this is deeply personal. For me, I obviously won't go into the details, colleagues will understand, but having worked with Oxfam, World Vision, many other organisations, I've seen this for myself. And it was absolutely right that members highlighted that last year was the deadliest year for humanitarian personnel, with the Gaza situation the most dangerous context. Over 400 aid workers have been killed there since October 2023, including the 3 British citizens serving with World Central Kitchen. And indeed, in March, attacks on a UN facility and on a Palestinian Red Crescent convoy showed that Israel must do much more to prevent further tragedies, and I'll come on to some of the specific comments on that in due course. And indeed, reports from Sudan highlight the tragic deaths of aid workers in the Zamzam camp, and these losses are part, as has been highlighted, of a global trend driven by the scale, the complexity and the urbanisation of armed conflict, Ms Lowell. But behind every incident is a family shattered, a team destabilised, and often a community and extremely vulnerable individuals left without assistance. And fatalities are, of course, only part of the tragic picture. Aid workers face rising levels of injury, abduction, detention, with immense psychological tolls. And they question sometimes whether their humanitarian logos and emblems help distinguish them from parties to conflict or indeed increase their risks. And these workers must have basic assurances of protection and must not be targeted. And indeed, the UK is committed to promoting compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and supporting mechanisms that protect those working in the world's most dangerous environments. The Honourable Member for Cheadle gave a powerful testimony in context for the debate and the wider risks, and he highlighted many of the contexts. I can assure him those workers are absolutely not forgotten, and he importantly highlighted the volunteers and often locals who are involved in these contexts. He raised a number of important questions. He asked me specifically about mental health, and I can assure him that the FCDO has funded additional mental health support for partners where there is identified gap in available service provision. My honourable friend from Strangford, who always speaks powerfully and passionately in these debates, as always. I absolutely commend, as he did, the work of church groups in his constituency, and indeed all faith groups, and we know of many faith groups in our constituencies, including in my own constituency in Cardiff South and Penarth, and partnerships with NGOs, faith groups and others are absolutely crucial in responding in these circumstances. They're often the first responders, they're often the first on the ground. And he specifically asked me about Afghanistan. He will know Afghanistan humanitarian operations face serious access challenges, particularly for women due to the Taliban ban on female aid workers. But despite those challenges, we have supported partners to negotiate local and case-by-case exemptions to continue the work and respond to the need of women and girls. The Honourable for West Dorset spoke about the convictions and the values that drive humanitarian aid workers. I absolutely have seen that myself repeatedly, and we hugely value their personal duty and service. He asked me some very specific questions about the humanitarian medal. It has been awarded to those who responded to the Moroccan earthquake, the Libyan floods, the Gaza crisis, and we're still working through the consideration of other humanitarian emergencies, and I appreciate him raising the point about eligibility. I'll certainly endeavour to come back to him on that issue. I can write back to him in due course, or one of my ministerial colleagues. The member for Dewsbury and Batley raised, I think, a very important issue about kidnappings and other incidents. It's not just these who die in attacks, often those who are kidnapped and detained, and the psychological toll that takes on them, physical toll often on them. And he rightly highlighted a number of contexts from Gaza to Lebanon. I have to say I don't accept his characterisation or comparison with Ukraine, not least having been there myself a few weeks ago under bombardment and seeing what was happening there to civilians. And the actions of my ministerial colleagues, I think, whether it's in relation to Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, or many, many other crises, are substantial and they are sincere. And I certainly won't apologise when it comes to the very difficult decisions we've had to take about ODA on keeping the people of this country safe in face of the very many threats that we face. And I will come on to that point in due course. But he asked me specifically about Lebanon, and we use our diplomatic levers to press all parties to honour and respect the humanitarian notification system. And that's, of course, a deconfliction mechanism to ensure that location of humanitarian facilities and movements are entitled to protection under international humanitarian law. And absolutely, we are working both in that conflict and many others to ensure that humanitarians are protected. There were many, many other important contributions from the member for Mid-Dunbartonshire and many, many others. I want to highlight a few particular points in response to comments that have been made. I think it's really, really important to note that not only have we seen attacks in relation to state-on-state violence and other conflicts, but we've also seen non-state armed groups growing in number, and that's increased the risk and complexity of many humanitarian environments, including across the Sahel and other locations, as members will be aware. And non-state groups actually remained the most frequent perpetrator of incidents globally in 2023, according to the aid worker security database, but the proportion of incidents involving state actors increased. And there are a whole series of factors here at play. We watch all of them very, very closely and try and respond in the best way that we can. On Gaza specifically, the Foreign Secretary, Ms Lewell, spoke to the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, on the 14th of March. The Minister for the Middle East also spoke with him on the 17th of March. The Foreign Secretary spoke directly to the Israeli Foreign Minister Saar on the 15th of April, where he raised directly concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the urgent need to restore the flow of aid. We are appalled, obviously, at recent attacks on aid workers, including on the UN Ops Guest House on the 19th of March, and, of course, the killing of rescue workers and paramedics, including at least 8 Palestinian Red Crescent medics on the 23rd of March. And our thoughts are very much with the victims and their families, and we expect those responsible to be held. I will in a moment, but I'm going to try and respond to all the comments, and then perhaps I'll take some interventions. We expect those responsible to be held to account, and we expect this to be done transparently. The Foreign Secretary has pressed Foreign Minister Saar to conclude the Military Advocate General's consideration of the World Central Kitchen incident, including determining whether criminal proceedings should be initiated. And indeed, the Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East have met the families of those killed in the attacks and assured them the government will continue to support their calls for justice. On the 28th of March, the UK and France called an urgent UN Security Council meeting to discuss the risks facing humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. And so this work is substantial. It's at many, many levels. We have also called for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society incident to be investigated fully at the Security Council on the 5th of April. And on the 21st of March, we had an E3 Foreign Minister's statement which made absolutely clear that the UN and its premises should be protected and never be a target. I was asked by members about arms exports. We've been very clear, and you've heard the Foreign Secretary speak on this and the Minister for the Middle East on many occasions. We, of course, suspended certain export licences to Israel for use in military operations in Gaza following a review that concluded there is a clear risk that items might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. And on the wider situation, we had meetings over the last few days, the Foreign Secretary and indeed the Minister for the Middle East with Prime Minister Mustafa, and we discussed the situation, of course, and the humanitarian situation in the West Bank too, as well as in Gaza. And we announced a £101 million package of support for the occupied Palestinian territories, and that will be dedicated at humanitarian relief, support for Palestinian economic development, and strengthening Palestinian Authority governance and reform. I was asked a lot of occasions about the support that we give specifically to the protection of aid workers. That includes support to the aid worker security database, core funding to UN OCHA, the International NGO Safety Organisation, funding at the country level in many, many contexts. For example, in Ukraine, we support the Haven consortium to provide a duty of care package, funding to the ICRC, funding to UN-managed country-based pooled funds. And of course, we are keeping all of our ODA priorities under review, but I can absolutely assure members that humanitarian response remains absolutely crucial to what we've been doing, particularly in those contexts that we mentioned most today, of Ukraine, of Gaza and of Sudan. There are many, many other contexts, but those three in particular have been highlighted by the Prime Minister. I was asked about disinformation by the Shadow Minister. We are absolutely aware of this challenge. We've worked specifically at the UN on this, Resolution 2730, which condemns that disinformation targeting aid workers, and we're working on a number of specific programmes in that regard. And she asked also specifically about the aid workers in Ukraine, and I mentioned that Haven programme in particular. And we're also providing personal protective equipment, individual first aid kits and so on through that scheme, and that's absolutely crucial. We constantly take work through the UN. We have called for a whole series of measures in those circumstances that I identified, but we also co-chaired a UN event demanding the release of aid workers detained by the Houthis in Yemen. We support a new political declaration by Australia to strengthen global commitments to protect aid workers, which will complement UN Security Council Resolution 2730. We respond to direct incidents at the highest levels, and I've identified some of those specifically in relation to Sudan, and we of course condemned those reported attacks on aid workers and pressed for the investigations, and we recently hosted that London Sudan conference alongside the African Union, EU, Germany and France to galvanise coordinated action. We must use momentum to keep applying pressure to all the parties there to comply with their obligations. We are also working very, very closely with organisations working to support female aid workers in particular who face particular issues in relation to restrictions, threats and sexual violence. And the UK invests in safeguarding and directly supports women's rights organisations to help mitigate those risks. And I try and take account, and my ministerial colleagues try and take account of all of the very specific and granular risks that workers face in contexts. But of course, this is more than just those specific circumstances. It's a wider commitment by the United Kingdom to the protection of aid workers, to humanitarian principles. I can absolutely assure members today that we will continue to uphold those principles and to stand up for them in the work that we do. So I thank honourable members, Ms Lewell, for their contributions today. I think they've been passionate, they've been sincere. I've heard what's been said. I will certainly communicate that with ministerial colleagues. And once again, thank the honourable member for sponsoring this debate in the first place.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank members for their contributions today. The honourable member for Strangford, I'd like to particularly really thank you for raising the point about women and educators being targeted in Sudan and Afghanistan. It was a really important point, and also about the community groups in our communities that are working hard for those humanitarian workers abroad. My honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, absolutely, we need more protections for workers abroad because they are being eroded, and it does seem at this point the world's governments are turning a blind eye to them. The honourable member for Dewsbury and Batley, I absolutely agree that I think there is time that we need some concrete actions, perhaps red lines that the government are going to put forward. And finally, my honourable friends, the member for Mid Dunbartonshire and Esher and Walton, I believe that the foreign aid cuts, I completely agree with you, that have been a real shameful retreat from Labour's legacy on foreign aid. In terms of the response from the Shadow Minister, was absolutely right to bring out how misinformation is causing even more danger for our aid workers. And finally, I'd like to thank the Minister, not just for his remarks today, but also for your service as a humanitarian worker. It's really, really appreciated, and I have so much respect for you. I do refer to my earlier comments that I think the government does need to step up. I truly believe that the government has more influence and more power than it perhaps gives itself credit for. And from hearing speeches today and elsewhere in this House, I think more and more members agree. Therefore, I urge the government to do more. Consider the suggestions that have been highlighted today, and perhaps bring out those red lines for what we are going to do as a government and as a House when we see that international humanitarian law is broken. Because it's vital that we act now. We have got no time to wait. We must act now. Thank you.
Humanitarian workers in conflict zones. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is now suspended until 4 p.m.